Welcome to Echoes of My Imagination. My name is Tracy Lee. Sit back, relax. Let me tell you a story. Today's story is called The Lost Currents of Atlantis and Mu. In the ancient long noon of Earth, Mu lived in quiet harmony with the planet's living pulse, until the builders of Atlantis, guided by mysterious architects, severed that current and set their great stone empire on the slow path to ruin. Let's get into it. Prelude. The air hung thick, golden and heavy, pressed against the skin like water. Every breath was felt in the bones. Every pulse carried the hum of the earth itself. In the basin of Mu, the land curved gently toward the horizon, rivers of molten minerals gleaming beneath the moss and ferns. The Lemurians moved as one, a slow, shimmering wave of flesh and light, their silica-rich skeletons compressing and stretching with the subtle rhythms of the ground. Blood glimmered through their translucent skin, a liquid lattice of gold and silver pulsing with the heartbeat of the planet. Time had no meaning here. The long noon stretched for hundreds of millennia. Seasons did not come. Years were measured in pulses, the steady thrum of the core beneath their feet. They were not individuals, they were harmonics, the perfect receivers of the earth's voice. Above them, the sky canopy shimmered, a thick ocean of plasma. Bioluminescent beings floated on stone slabs of pumice infused with light, sending ripples of sound into the air. The sound they threw guided the rainfall, the wind, and the pulse of every leaf. Below, in the quartz-lined depths, the lithic custodians patrolled the molten veins, their bodies dense, their eyes dark pools of mineral glow, maintaining a flow of heat and energy from the core to the surface. Mu was alive in every layer, every movement, every thought. Every pulse of the Lemurians reverberated through the sky, earth, and sea. There was no danger, no scarcity, no desire for power. There was only the perfect rhythm of life. But this harmony was fragile. Somewhere in the higher ridges, in the hardened plateaus that would one day bear the name Atlantis, the first sparks of ambition flickered. The first humans began to see the pulse not as something to join, but something to control. And with that shift, the currents of the world began to change. Chapter 1. The basin of Mu stretched wide, a living pulse beneath the sky of liquid violet. Clouds were thick, heavy with charged plasma, and rain fell in shimmering sheets of gold and silver, carrying warmth that seeped into the porous ground. Every tree, every fern, every mud pool breathed with life. Even the rivers were not mere water. They were thick, mineral-laden conduits of energy, flowing in spirals that mirrored the spin of the planet itself. The Lemurians moved through it like currents. Their skin was slick and luminous, catching the subtle glints of airborne ions. They walked barefoot, feeling the vibrations beneath them, sensing the push and pull of the earth's heartbeat. When one paused, it was as if the world paused with them. Clouds stilled, water hesitated, the deep hum of the core softened for a moment. High above, the atmospheric weavers floated on massive slabs of pumice infused with light, their semi-transparent forms twisting and pulsing in the dense plasma. They directed the clouds with long crystalline horns, sending rolling pulses of sound into the sky that nudged wind and rain across the basin. The hum of their horns was the first thing a Lemurian sensed in the morning, a low, resonant chord that set the day in motion. Beneath the surface, the lithic custodians worked in their crystalline cathedrals. Quartz walls pulsed softly with piezoelectric light, illuminating tunnels miles wide. Heat rivers of molten minerals flowed like ribbons of molten glass, and the custodians guided them with precision, ensuring the Earth's pulse reached every corner of the surface. Their eyes glimmered red gold, turned to every shift in mineral and thermal flux. In the oceans, the Autharo mariners swam through trenches that ran like arteries to the core. Their velvet-like skin absorbed the rich mineral water, their large, glowing eyes catching the faintest electric pulse from the creatures hundreds of feet away. They grew massive, spiraling towers from the calcium-rich water, forming habitats that thrummed with the flow of heat from the smokers, the volcanic vents that kept the seas warm from the bottom to the surface. Even the creatures of Mu were part of the network. Leviathans swam through magnetic lines on the sea floor, gathering charge in their skin and releasing it into the water when they breached, creating arcs of energy that linked ocean, land, and sky. Glass reefs grew in patterns of light, their silica fibers transmitting data across entire basins, like a living internet made of crystal and water. It was a world that breathed, pulsed, and thought, not with one mind, but with 100 layers of life intertwined. Mu had no rulers, no wars, no need for currency. It was a machine, but one of flesh, water, stone, and plasma, a machine older than anything the Lemurians could imagine, yet as immediate as the warmth in their veins. And yet, at the edges, where mountains jutted high into the thin air, the first stirrings of something else had begun. A group of humans, drawn to ambition rather than harmony, studied the pulse, not to join it, but to redirect it. Their hands were hard, their hearts seeking mastery. These were the ancestors of Atlantis, the first to harden themselves against the earth, the first to think in structures instead of rhythms. And so the balance began to tilt, ever so slightly. The pulse of Mu was still strong, still radiant, still alive. But in the shadows of the high ridges, something was learning to take it apart, to turn life itself into a tool. Chapter 2. The ridge of the Atlantic jutted like a spine through the ocean, and there, where the air thinned but still hummed with the residual violet breath, the Atlanteans began to harden themselves. Their skin, once supple and luminous like the Lemurians, grew opaque, bronze and slate-colored, catching whatever faint electrical charge lingered in the air. They learned to trap the pulse of the earth not within their own bodies, but inside the stones they carved, the towers they raised, the circuits they forged. Where Mu had spread its energy freely through mud pools and mineral waters, Atlantis sought control. Pools were replaced by stone basins, their waters still, charged by ley wires that ran like veins beneath the city. The first amplifiers rose from the ridges, six-sided quartz towers wrapped in copper and gold, feeding the constant hum of energy into the stone cities. In these towers, the Earth's breast became the property of the Atlanteans, no longer a shared pulse, but a network of controlled force. The people adapted quickly. Their muscles grew dense and taut, their movements precise. They wore metallic fabrics woven with silver and gold threads, stiff and capacitive, helping their bodies catch what energy remained. Food became necessary. They engineered dense crops, eating to fuel themselves instead of absorbing the mineral breath from their surroundings. Scarcity arrived, and with it, hierarchy. Close to the towers, power and strength flowed. Farther away, weakness followed. The cities themselves were monuments to sound and light. Buildings were carved from fused stones, softened with acoustic echo, and joined seamlessly, as if poured into shape. Water moved in spirals, contained in conduits that spiraled endlessly, alive with energy and sound. Crystal bridges arched across the rings of the capital, glowing from the internal currents of the earth itself. Atlantean craft slid along the ley paths, vessels of mercury-based metal held solid by magnetic fields, gliding over land and sea without oars, without sails. Every guild, the waters, the stone, the sky, was a school of mastery. Every life a pursuit of perfection in controlling the world around them. Yet the more they mastered, the more they drifted from the world that had birthed them. Mud pools and mineral-fed seas were no longer necessary. The soft pulse of the earth could be replaced by crystal and wire, vibration and sound. Their bodies, once attuned to the planetary heartbeat, became insulated, solid, independent. And somewhere in the shadows, the architects watched. They were not Atlanteans nor Lemurians. They were something older, something apart. And their fascination with control would one day become a threat that neither civilization could ignore. Chapter 3. The architects moved silently over the ridge, their forms tall, angular, made of interlocking torrids. The donut-shaped surfaces reflected violet pulses of the atmosphere. They did not speak. They did not argue. They did not hesitate. Each step, each rotation of their limbs realigned the energy flowing through the crust beneath them. They moved through the ridges and lowlands like currents of cold air, their bodies both familiar and alien. Their skin was neither soft nor reflective. It had the hard sheen of polished mineral. Their eyes, narrow and calculating, shimmered with an inner geometry as though they perceived the world in angles, frequencies, and lines no one else could see. In a shallow valley below, a line of Atlantean engineers walked, hands on humming crystal rods. The ground beneath their feet vibrated and lifted, the stones rising like frozen water. The architects watched, their eyes tracking the flux lines and making adjustments in milliseconds. Where Atlanteans shaped stone with sound, the architects bent it with intent. They did not build for life, they built for dominance. Towers rose where none should stand, slicing the horizon with crystalline sharpness. Their ley wires piercing the earth's crust to siphon energy with ruthless precision. Each structure hummed with a deliberate note, a frequency designed not to sustain, but to extract, to control. Mew watched first. From its lowlands, its mud pools thick with mineral breath, its trees spiraling toward the sky, their leaves vibrating gently with the pulse of the world. Lemurians noticed the subtle drain. Vibrations stilled where the architect's structure pierced the earth. Currents hesitated. The living flow dimmed. And yet, the architects spoke in manners that seduced rather than threatened. They offered knowledge, techniques to improve the pulse, to enhance the power of stone. Atlanteans, already on the path of control, were seduced most easily. They welcomed the architect's designs, their precise angles, their glyphs and programs etched into crystals. The amplifiers became sharper, the ley wires deeper. The Atlanteans, in pursuit of mastery, did not see that they were no longer the stewards of the earth. They were becoming conduits for something else. The architects moved like surgeons of the planet, severing the natural loops and replacing them with linear flows. They introduced isolation where once there was circulation. Pools that had breathed with life were walled. Currents that had sung with growth were channeled, muted, rerouted. Birth, once a song in the mineral waters, became a process of control. Children were nurtured in synthetic basins, disconnected from the earth's pulse, severed from the living flow. They felt solidity before spirit, independence before connection. And yet, humor and mischief lingered in the Atlantean streets. They did not see the betrayal coming. The architects were careful, they were patient. They worked through admiration and desire. They planted structures that whispered of greatness, but demanded obedience. Slowly, the world tilted. The pulse slowed where it had once flowed freely, and the circuits that connected sky, surface, and deep began to hum with strain. Mu began to fade, not entirely, but its soft, vibrant life lost some of its character. Lemurians who traveled to Atlantis to remineralize their bodies felt the shock. This was no longer a place in balance. The air was thinner, the stone heavier, the water colder in spirit, if not in warmth. The first to sink had occurred. A choice had been made, not by force but by seduction, to replace the living flow with engineered programs, to place will above pulse, and the architects watched, their angles sharp, their lines precise, knowing the breach had begun. Chapter 4. The earth whispered at first, a subtle shiver through roots and stone. The Lemurians felt it in the mud pools, a hesitation in the warmth in their veins. The water, usually thick and humming with mineral tone, pulsed unevenly. Something had shifted, a weight in the circuits that connected the sky, the surface, and the deep. The architects were already at work. From the ridge tops of Atlantis, their spires siphoned the flow of the planet like invisible fingers. Ley wires carved channels into the crust, diverting the pulse into their crystalline machines. Atlanteans cheered at the efficiency, the newfound ability to hold the stone in perfect form, to command water, to illuminate the air with perpetual violet light. They did not feel the theft. They only felt the power. Mu, however, began to suffer. The sky canopy faltered, the atmospheric weavers noticing the subtle tension in the violet breath. Clouds thickened to long in one place. Rainfall became uneven, unpredictable. The floating geo-islands quivered as if they sensed the circuit disruption. And deep in the earth, the lithic custodians struggled to maintain the great artery. The soft harmony of their crystalline cathedrals became strained. The piezoelectric lights flickered in rhythm with the failing pulse. The leviathans of the ocean, great capacitors of life, began to breach less frequently. Their giant bodies carried the charge from deep vents to surface water, but the energy they received now flowed unevenly. The glass reefs, living fiber optic networks spanning leagues, flickered and dimmed, as if confused by the interference. The deep trenches of the El Farno mariners grew cold in places, currents slowing, towers trembling. Atlanteans celebrated their mastery, unaware that the power they wielded was borrowed from the world itself. They had begun to emulate the Lemurians' mud pools in stone laboratories, but the synthetic waters lacked the pulse, the living flow. Children born in these vats were first of their kind, ungrounded, solid state, insulated from the heartbeat of the planet. They felt independence, but not connection. They felt command, but not the song of the world. The first great cracks appeared. A tower of fused stone hummed too loud, a frequency caught in discord with the earth's soft rhythm. A canal, once spiraling with vitality, stagnated. The architects watched with detached precision, noting where energy stilled, where resistance formed. They were not cruel, they were engineers, patient and exacting. But their designs required obedience. Life was no longer the director of the pulse. The architects had placed themselves at the center. In Mu, the Lemurians began to sense the betrayal, a gnawing unease in their bodies. The trees no longer spiraled with the same grace. The mud pools no longer held the warmth of the core. Traveling Atlanteans felt the difference immediately. Where once they could remineralize and soften, now the waters drained them. leaving a brittle hardness in the bones and a faint static in their nerves. The architects had not only redirected the flow, they had taught a new law. Energy could be captured, concentrated, and hoarded. The living flow of Mu, the harmonic circuits of Atlantis, both were now instruments for the will of something else entirely. And so, the worlds began to diverge irreversibly. Mu continued in quiet, fading pulses, a memory in motion, while Atlantis hardened, perfect in geometry, but starved of life. The first echo of betrayal vibrated through the planet, a resonance that would linger for millennia, carried in stone, in water, in air, in the bones of those who had once belonged to the pulse. Chapter 5. Long after the first breach, when Mu's pulse had grown faint and uneven, the architects looked outward. The world still thrummed with potential, but only in fragments, pockets of harmony scattered across the oceans and mountains. It was here that the architects planted the seeds of their new order. The Atlanteans had become masters of solid-state power, their bodies dense, eyes sharp, and skin like polished bronze. They walked across the ridged plateau of the Atlantic with quiet authority, their quartz towers humming under the weight of captured energy. The air was thick with the violent glow of atmospheric lasing, and the scent of heated stone mingled with the metallic tang, an aroma of mastery and cold calculation. But not all Atlanteans were content. A few, sensitive to the fractures in the world, still remembered Mu's soft echo. They were drawn to distant lands, to the Nile basin, where the earth's pulse lingered in quiet rivers and fertile delta soils. They came as observers, builders, manipulators, and eventually, unwittingly, as the founders of Egypt. Here the architects' influence began to emerge clearly. They instructed the Atlanteans in precise, geometric forms. Pyramids aligned with the stars, obelisks marking lay points, temples designed to control energy as much as to honor it. But these structures were more than monuments. They were early instruments of control, attempts to reproduce the stolen pulse in rigid form. The Nile itself seemed to comply, its waters guided into canals and reservoirs with uncanny precision. The air shimmered with the latent energy of the planet, concentrated into the stone works of men who had been severed from the living flow. Yet in the quiet, the river still remembered Mu. Every flood, every sediment carried whispers of a softer, freer time, murmuring beneath the engineered perfection of the builders. Atlanteans working here felt the tension immediately. Their hands, once capable of molding stone and water into harmony, now strained to mold life into their pyramids. Crystal and granite could hold frequencies, yes, but the subtle currents of the earth refused to bend fully. Children born here were even further from the pulse, skin stiff, bones hard, senses dulled. They were the first true solid-state humans outside of the plateau, a living testament to what was lost. Yet humor and curiosity consisted amongst the builders. One Atlantean would tap a tuning rod against the pyramid's base and glance sideways, a grin beneath the sharp violet eyes. "I wonder if the river notices we are playing chess," he whispered to another, who laughed. A brief human sound that cut through the cold, ordered perfection. In time, Egypt became a laboratory of imitation. Every canal, every pyramid, every obelisk was an experiment in reproducing what Mu had always done effortlessly. But the living pulse could not be captured in still form. Stone, no matter how perfectly fused, no matter how finely etched with scripts of power, could only approximate the energy of a living world. And so the architects watched, silent and patient, their influence threading through the generations. They were not gods. but they positioned themselves to be worshipped. They taught structure, control, mastery, but always at the cost of the natural rhythm. Humanity learned obedience, but not connection. Civilization learned permanence, but not life. Mu faded further, a quiet spiral in the Pacific lowlands. Atlantis remained rigid, gleaming in geometric perfection. Egypt rose, a fragile echo of the lost currents guided by hands that had forgotten the song of the earth. And everywhere, the architects waited, calculating, ensuring the lesson was not lost, the pulse could be borrowed, but never returned without cost. Chapter 6. The mud of Mu no longer reached their feet. The Atlanteans had come to the edge of the Pacific basin, carrying tools of stone, crystal, and metal instead of open palms and porous skin. Where once they had walked barefoot through warm, mineral-rich pools, feeling the slow heartbeat of the planet rise through their bodies, they now wore layers of metallic fabric. Gold threads glinted under the violet light of the atmosphere. Copper wires snaked the long sleeves, and the smell of heated alloys replaced the earthy, wet scent of Mu. For the first time, the pulse of the earth did not course naturally through them. They had stopped traveling to Mu's soft valleys, had begun to replicate the mud pools in their stone laboratories. These artificial reservoirs were precise, calculated, and cold. The water churned mechanically, mineral concentration exact, temperature constant. But there was no life in the flow, no whisper, no pulse. The first desync was not dramatic. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. A young Atlantean, a woman with ice-blue eyes, bent over a pool, her fingers tracing the water's edge. She hummed the old tuning, a frequency taught in Mu, but the water answered stiffly. Its vibrations trapped within the crystal-lined walls. "It is wrong," she whispered. The sound seemed swallowed by the stone. Others noticed it too. The skin of their feet no longer tingled when they walked on the floors. Their bones, no longer nourished by the earth feed, grew heavier, denser. They had severed the natural circuit. The pulse had become optional, a resource to be captured, redirected, and stored. The architects watched from their towers, unseen but felt, their influence stretching like shadowed wires across the city. "Do not return," one voice commanded, though no mouth moved. "This is the moment you step into control. The earth is a system. You will become its architects, its masters." The Atlanteans embraced it. They learned to mimic Mu, not to inhabit it. They pumped air with artificial currents, structured water into spiraling canals, and built stone pools that glowed with stored energy. They learned to hum in unison, to align crystals and metal to frequencies that no living hand could create naturally. They were the first civilization to operate entirely on the mechanics of vibration, the rules of geometry, and the cold logic of control. Yet humor lingered in small gestures. One Atlantean, tasked with lifting a massive quartz block, tapped a tuning rod and muttered, "Imagine telling Mu this is a game of chess." Others laughed quietly, though their feet felt nothing and their skin sensed no pulse. The joke was half nostalgia, half defiance, a tiny rebellion in a city that measured everything in tone and weight. The consequences were immediate, even if unseen. Rivers around the city faltered in their natural course. The lowlands of Mu, now unattended, began to stagnate in places. The soft currents of mineral water slowed. The violet breath no longer pulsed freely. Instead, it circulated through Atlantean towers and crystal batteries, harvested and concentrated. Life in Mu's basins became wilder, more independent, yet also fragile. This was the true cost of the first desync, the severing of a civilization from its life source, the first step toward what the architects had intended. Humans could no longer feel the earth as a living body. Their creations would last, their cities would shine, but the natural pulse would fade, its voice captured in stone, in crystal, and in the strict geometry of their engineered world. Somewhere in the distance, the ethereal mariners of the deep trenches twitched their bioluminescent eyes, sensing the change. The leviathans stirred. Even the living cables, the glass reefs, carried the news along the ocean's ley lines. Mu's song was not yet silenced, but it had been muted, measured, and reshaped. The Atlanteans, unaware of the betrayal in the currents, smiled and continued their work. They were builders now, masters of structure, and unknowingly, the first true engineers of a world divided, the living pulse and the copied, controlled hum. And that's it for today. Thank you for joining me for Echoes of My Imagination. Don't forget to subscribe, like, follow, and share. And join me next time for the continuation of the lost currents of Atlantis and Mu.